for the meta introduction. Before quite a few of you were born, Professors Nilsson and Nilsson were setting up humor conferences, and if it weren't for them, the whole international humor studies movement wouldn't have taken off. They met here at ASU for several years, and then they were very instrumental in creating the International Society for Humor Studies and the journal, which was launched in 1989. So if it weren't for them, I probably wouldn't still be in this field. I probably would have gone off on something else. So I'm very grateful to them for all their years of dedication. When Aline asked me about something to do with heroes, and then she started talking about Arizona politics, I knew that she had changed the subject significantly. And then she sent me a whole bunch. She sent me envelopes full of stuff about governors and sheriffs in Arizona. And it was funny, but I didn't know what I could say about it. I didn't want to just hold up, Pat Arpaio stuff. So I figured I'd do something that had a bit of theory to it and also a bit of history to it. And it's not going to quite touch on heroism, but it's going to touch on leadership. Some of these are my own ideas, especially the first part about humor and leadership, and some of it's going to be just fairly familiar American history. As we go along, if you've got a comment or a question right as you're thinking about it, just say so. This is a seminar. This isn't a huge lecture. Say, we got lots of time, so if you want to stop me at any point, that'd be just fine. So I'll start with humor and leadership, then we'll talk about American history. And then I want to talk about ridicule, because I think almost everybody gets ridiculed wrong. Almost everybody who talks about ridicule, as we heard this morning, talks about it as if it were a form of serious criticism. And that, I think, is just a mistake. So I want to talk about what ridicule is. And if we have time, at the end, I want to show a piece from The Onion from 2008. It's about John McCain, but we'll see it when we get to that. Humor and leadership. I want to distinguish between two kinds of leadership. A lot of the work that I do is with corporations. And so I study political leadership, but I also do lots of talks for companies like IBM and AT&T, et cetera. And most people in the business world distinguish old-style leadership from new-style leadership. And I call the old-style emperor model of leadership. And what I mean by that is this is a character whose basic function is to wield power. So the old-fashioned leader, the emperor, the general, the pharaoh in Egypt, for example, wields power. And the leader is typically somebody who comes from the military, because in the ancient world, the way that you got to be the leader of a nation or a group of people was you led them in battle. The basic function is giving commands. Just as in the military, if I can tell you what to do, but you can't tell me what to do, then I've got power over you. And the more levels to the organization, like in the traditional military, you had at least 10. In General Motors, you had, I think, 11. The higher up the hierarchy you are, the better off you are. The more people you can tell what to do, but they can't tell you what to do, the better. Commands are backed up by punishment. So if I'm your boss and I tell you what to do and you don't do it, then I get to punish you. And a lot of these leaders took special relish in that. Institutions are obviously hierarchies. Now in this system, I want to just pick out some more features of this system. If anybody wants this whole thing, I can just send it to you as a PowerPoint. Leaders maximize the differences between themselves and others. They hoard knowledge. If I want to be in charge of an organization, I don't want you to know everything that I know, because you might try to take my job. They also hoard responsibilities for exactly the same reason. If they make a mistake, they hide their mistakes and they hide their imperfections. They're especially wary of satirical humor pointed at them. I'm going to give a couple of examples in a minute. They ban humor about themselves. They suppress humor generally because humor is egalitarian. Humor allows people to be at the same level, especially leaders using humor about themselves. I'm going to give several examples of this. When leaders make jokes about themselves, everybody feels comfortable, and then the whole hierarchical system tends to break down. And also because humor is hard to control. You know this from the classroom, right? One of the first things a teacher ever said to me in first grade, I remember this. She said, "What's so funny, Mr. Morrell?" Well, I was really naive. I was 6 years old. So I took it for a real question. I said, "Tommy's desk has got this huge pocket." She was not amused. In school, kids who've got some artistic talent might go to the art room. And kids with some musical ability might go to the music room. But kids with a sense of humor like me went to the principal's office. So teachers see humor as a threat to their control, and same with leaders. Okay. So these are some of the features that typify the old system. Let me give you an example. William Howard Taft. He came right before Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt has got this big grin on his face in a lot of pictures. But Taft was never photographed laughing. Taft also weighed 330 pounds on the day of his inauguration. They had a new bathtub installed in the White House at this time. Before that, there were no bathtubs in the White House. And Taft got stuck. It took 4 guys over 2 hours to get him out of the tub so that he could go be inaugurated as President of the United States. But he tried to control that story as tightly as he could because he didn't want it to get out, and it's obvious why. So the old-fashioned leader wants to be in control and therefore doesn't want humor about himself. A far more, I think that's General Pershing, by the way. A far more extreme example of humorlessness was this gentleman. I shouldn't say gentleman, this man. Hitler, in 1933, after taking absolute power of Germany, one of the first things he did was he set up joke courts. And these were special courts for trying people who made fun of either him or the Nazi uniform or any part of his famous Third Reich. Several nightclub comics in Nazi Germany were hanged, for example. One from Berlin was hanged for naming his horse Adolf. So this is how seriously Hitler took humor. Now, I want to contrast all this with what I call post-heroic leadership. A good example of post-heroic leadership for me would be Barack Obama. And I'm going to be giving you several examples from the business world also. They don't emphasize their power. They minimize the differences between themselves and others. Hugging a person is one way to minimize the difference between you and them. Hierarchies are flattened. Since 1990, for example, big corporations have tended to go from 10 levels to 4 levels or 3 levels, and they've created cross-functional teams. In many ways, they just spread the responsibility, spread the knowledge around, and allow everybody access to everything that they need. Carrots replace sticks. That is, the motivation is by incentive rather than by punishment. In post-heroic leadership, I've already said this, they share knowledge, they delegate responsibility, they empower people, and they can laugh at themselves. And they appreciate the value of humor generally. My favorite example, and this is what so encouraged me about President Obama, it was between the time he was elected and the time he was inaugurated. He had one of those press conferences where they hit him with all the heavy questions. What about the economy? What about blah, blah, blah. And finally somebody tossed him a softball question. And they said, we hear you're going to get a dog for the White House. What kind of dog are you going to get? And finally, Barack kind of smiled and he could relax. He said, well, the dog we're thinking of getting is a mutt, like me. And as soon as he said that, it seems to me that this country could breathe a sigh of relief, because this is a leader who could see himself with a sense of humor. It seems to me that is irreplaceable. That's valuable in a way that nothing else is valuable. Okay. Humor in post-heroic leadership. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of these phenomena. First, it reduces the differences of power and status. Creates rapport. It serves as what I call a social lubricant. That sounds sleazy, but I don't mean it in that way. What I mean is humor reduces the friction between people, especially people who have to work together. Humor gets people's attention. This was pointed out this morning. For example, in the world of advertising, and especially in the world of politics. And that helps it gets remembered. There was another paper this morning about humor and remembering messages. Humor involves what I call mental distance, and I'm going to give some examples of this. And so it lowers stress. William Fry, the doctor from Stanford University Medical School, he did some of the pioneering studies on how humor lowers the level of, for example, stress chemicals in the blood. It lowers the blood pressure and heart rate, muscle tension, all this other stuff. And lastly, humor fosters a creative problem solving. Okay. I want to use a theory of humor, which has a fancy name, but I'm going to start off with a simple way of describing it. I'm going to take this from Norman Cousins. Norman Cousins was a TV producer in the 1970s and 80s, and he was one of the first people to get the medical world interested in the value of humor. Cousins writes this: humor is a sort of train wreck of the mind. You're going along a track and there's a sudden collapse of logic, the cars go off the track, and then they pile up and build into laughter. Now that's just a first pass. Let me give you a more formulaic presentation, and that's from psychology and philosophy. It's called the incongruity theory. If you were there this morning, you heard quite a few references to this. Humor is enjoying something that doesn't fit your mental patterns and your expectations. That is, you get a mental jolt, your mental train goes off the track to, is that a mixed metaphor? No, that's just a regular metaphor. And somehow the jolt that you get, the train wreck, is fun for you. Simple example. 3 years ago, we came back from our summer break to find that our house had burned down. We actually got a call about 100 miles from home from our neighbor who said there's 14 fire trucks outside your house. Anyway, for the next year, we spent in a little apartment trying to get things together. And while we were there, I always had to do the laundry, and I had to take stuff to the laundromat. The very first time I took the laundry to the laundromat, as I was putting stuff in the washer, I noticed this sign on the wall. Now, the person who wrote this sign, I'm sure, had a very straightforward, not incongruous message, which was, when your clothes are all done washing, take them out so somebody else can use the machine. But I pictured that when the machine stops, I pictured the buzzer going off and everybody in the place stripping. Now, that's incongruous, and if you like the incongruity, that's what humor is about. Okay? I've got a file cabinet, and 2 of the drawers are full of signs, and these are a couple of my favorite signs. This one just speaks for itself. Anybody know what they're actually selling? Clothes, of course. Kids' clothes. Here's another example. My family and I vacationed in the Adirondacks Mountains. This is about 8 years ago. And there was one store in the middle of town. It was the restaurant. It was the gas station. It's where you got the bait to go fishing. It was the post office. It was everything. And they put on their awning this sign. So, incongruity is something upsets your mental framework, something upsets your expectations, and rather than be bothered by it, you like it. Okay. Benefits of humor in politics, and I'll go through these fairly quickly. As I said, it reduces differences of power and status, creating rapport. My favorite example here, and this guy's kind of the patron saint of humor in the business world, is from Southwest Airlines. And his name is Herb Kelleher. Here's Kelleher clinging to the side of a plane. Notice he doesn't have shoes on. Southwest Airlines incorporates humor into their training, and they argue that it's valuable in a way that nothing else in the world of business. Here's a very early article about Herb Kelleher. Here he's flying without using a plane. He's got one of those World War I leather helmets on and goggles. Is Herb Kelleher America's best CEO? He's wild, he's crazy, he's in a tough business. He's built the most successful airline in the United States. There's a whole book about Kelleher's sense of humor and his corporate style. He retired a couple years ago because he's in his late 70s. The book is called Nuts, and this is named after the little bag of peanuts that they used to give you on the plane. Kelleher's own management style and leadership style, like Barack Obama's to a certain extent, incorporates humor into the very method of communication and the very method of, for example, giving instructions. My favorite example is from about 15 years ago. Southwest Airlines came up with a new advertising slogan, so they started using it. Within 2 weeks, they got a call from the head of another airline that said, that's our slogan. We've been using that for over a year. Now, what's the standard way to solve that problem? In American business, you got 2 companies that want to use the same slogan. Who do you call first? You call lawyers right away. Litigation, right? It's going to take time and money. Kelleher called the other airline. He said, look, we don't have the time or the money to fool around here. He said, I hereby challenge you to an arm wrestling match in the Dallas Sportatorium. This is an old wrestling palace. And he called the event Malice in Dallas. This is the event. Here's Kelleher. At that time, he was in his mid-60s. He's a chain smoker, and he drinks Wild Turkey bourbon. He drinks quite a bit of it. The guy from the other airline was 37 years old, was in terrific shape, had never smoked, and it was clear when the other guy got in the ring, he was going to whoop Herb's ass. By the way, this is Herb's manager. Across his chest, he has a bandiero, only instead of bullets in those little compartments, he has airline-sized bottles of Wild Turkey bourbon. Here's a close-up of the event. He's smoking even as he's arm wrestling the other guy. Now, Kelleher got the whole place laughing for over an hour and a half. He had 500 people from Southwest who were in the stands just cheering for him. They didn't have to be there, but they just wanted to see their leader and how he would respond. He got his ass whooped as far as arms wrestling. But because he got the other guy laughing so hard, at the end of the whole thing, the guy from the other airline said, "Oh, you keep the slogan too." Now that isn't standard leadership. It certainly isn't standard American business practice. But it's how Herb Kelleher runs Southwest Airlines. Okay. Losing. Here he's losing badly. Here's the guy who took over as CEO of Southwest Airlines. His name is Gary Kelly. Here he's dressed as Edna Turnblad from Hairspray. I won't say anything more about that. Okay, so you get the idea here. Here is Tom Peters. Tom Peters is the most successful business consultant of all time. Tom gets $150,000 for a 1-hour seminar. He's kind of my personal deity. Here's Tom Peters' quote. "Welcome to a world where imagination is the source of value in the economy. It's an insane world. And in an insane world, sane organizations make no sense." Okay. So 2, humor serves as a social lubricant. Humor smooths out a relationship, friction in a relationship, almost instantaneously. Here's a nice example, a former leader of Chrysler in the 1970s. Gene Caffiero. When he took over Chrysler, they had a lot of management problems in the United States, and they had even more in Europe. They had an auto plant in England, for example, not far from London, where the workers were almost ready to just trash the place. So Caffiero got on a plane, he flew over to England. As he went up to the front of the building, the Chrysler facility in England, he was met by 3 big guys. They came up, and one guy said, "I'm Eddie McCluskey, and I'm a communist." He stuck out his hand. Caffiero said, "Hi, I'm Gene Caffiero, I'm a Presbyterian." He put out his hand. That smooths things out. It reduces friction between people. Humor also gets attention and is remembered. This is a feature that's very obvious from advertising, for example. Let me give you a really small example. This is a small plumbing company in Nova Scotia, and they've only got 2 trucks. Now, they could have painted the 2 trucks in a familiar way, but instead, being a plumbing company, they came up with a new design for the plumbing design. Now, if this truck goes by, you're going to remember it much better than if it just, suppose it just said AIM Electrical and Plumbing Services. This is the kind of thing, it's going to lodge in your mind. Okay, second example. This is Bakersfield, California, Corn County, Bakersfield, California. Here's how all the sheriff's cars are painted in Bakersfield, California. In case you can't read it, it's sort of like Homer Simpson. We'll kick your ass and take your donuts too. Third example is from a country. In the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union just collapsed, and a lot of little countries went away, they had to do a lot of stuff for themselves that their former communist overlords had been doing for them for half a century. One little country that split off was called Abkhazia. And for the first time, they had to come up with their own postage stamps. Now, they had lived under communist rule for over half a century, so these were the first 2 stamps that they, 2 commemorative stamps, and these are of Marx and Lenin. And this is how they did it. These became instant hits for stamp collectors around the world, and they just started to make money in new ways.
That's great.